This video will review the 6 elements of the contract, and then we'll provide more detail on the elements of offer, acceptance, and consideration. The 6 elements of the contract include offer, acceptance, consideration, and we could actually stop right here. Once we have these 3 elements, we do have a legal agreement. The next 3 elements are issues that could negate one or both parties' duty to perform. So in addition to offer, acceptance, and consideration, we also have to show that the parties have capacity. We have to show that the agreement or the subject matter is legal, and we have to show that neither party has any defense to the contract. So we're going to start by reviewing the requirements for an offer. There are 3 requirements. Number 1, the offeror has to have the intent to be bound. And we need to know the legal test. How do we determine whether a party has intent to be bound? We use the objective theory of contracts. And we studied this theory in the case of Lucy versus Zimmer. So I encourage you to go back and review that case, study the facts of the case, what it was the parties were arguing over, and how the court applied the objective theory of contracts. The second requirement is that the offer must contain clear and definite terms. And the third requirement is that the offer must be communicated to the offeree. Now we're going to move on to the requirement of acceptance. Once we have an offer, we still don't have a contract. That offer must be accepted, and we need to know how to identify an acceptance. And acceptance also has 3 requirements that pretty closely mirror the requirements of an offer. Requirement number 1, the offeree must show intent to be bound. Again, we determine this by applying the objective theory of contracts. Number 2, the offeree must accept clear and definite terms. When we analyze this requirement, on the acceptance side, we have to apply the mirror image rule. The mirror image rule says that the terms of the acceptance must be the mirror image of the offer. If the offeree attempts to change, modify, or add any terms that were in the original offer, the offeree has not accepted. Rather, they have rejected the offer and created a counteroffer. Requirement number 3, the acceptance must be communicated to the offeror. And we studied this specific rule. Silence is not acceptance. Acceptance can be communicated verbally, it can be communicated in writing, it can even be communicated through behavior, through actions. But silence that is unsupported by any type of non-verbal or behavioral acceptance, silence all by itself does not qualify as acceptance. Okay, so once we have an offer and acceptance, we have reciprocal agreements. In order for that to be enforceable under the law, we have to show that it is supported by consideration. Remember that both parties have to be providing consideration under the agreement. The definition is a 2-part definition. Number 1, consideration must be bargained for. It's an act or a promise that's bargained for or solicited. And number 2, the promise or the act must create a legal detriment for that party. There are 2 types of legal detriment. 1 is a promise to perform an act that you are not already legally required to perform. So we can see that this creates a legal detriment because it creates a new legal obligation. Number 2, a promise to refrain from an act that you have the legal right to engage in. Again, this creates a legal detriment because you are eliminating a legal opportunity. On this slide, we're going to elaborate on these 2 parts of the definition. The examples I'm going to give you were items that we discussed in class. When we talk about whether actions are bargained for, we studied a specific type of transaction where we know for certain that the action was not bargained for. And this is what we call past consideration. Past consideration is where the action under the agreement happened before the other party promised any type of performance. So a typical example would be if I find your lost dog, I'm your neighbor, I find your dog, I collect the dog, I bring it back to you just out of goodwill. At the time I deliver your dog, you're thankful, so you promise to pay me some money. You have made a promise and you may have a moral obligation to pay me, but you do not have a legal obligation to pay me. The reason is that my performance, which was the act of returning your dog, my performance was not bargained for. I did not return your dog in anticipation of receiving payment. I did not return your dog in response to your promise to pay me. When I returned your dog, I had no expectation from you, no promise from you, no offer from you that you would pay me in response to my performance. Okay, if we look at this slide, at the area that's highlighted, now we're going to move down to the issue of legal detriment. Remember that one way we have a legal detriment is we promise to perform an act we are not already legally obligated to do. So the 2 sub-bullets that we're going to look at These are types of behavior that do not create a legal detriment. It can get a little bit confusing because we're sort of studying this from a negative perspective, rather than listing all of the numerous examples of things that do qualify as legal detriment. We identify 2 specific transactions that we know do not meet the requirement. So example number 1, we talked about in the class lecture. If I am already obligated by law to perform the act, then it cannot serve as consideration. For example, police officers are generally required under the law to seize and apprehend suspected criminals. When they do so, they generally are not entitled to collect a reward that had been offered by a member of the public because their action, their arrest of the individual, was already required by them. There was no new additional legal obligation created. Another example of an action that does not qualify is when we promise to do something that we are already required to do under another existing contract. To have a new contract, I have to promise a new act. I have to create a new legal detriment. I encourage you to review the example in the textbook about the swimming pool. We talked about this one in class. But it creates an example of an attempt to create a second agreement, but the second agreement was unenforceable because the contractor, the swimming pool contractor, was not promising any additional work. If we move to our last example, now we're looking at promise to refrain from a legal act. Remember that in class we studied the case of Hammer versus Sidway. This was the agreement between the uncle and the nephew. If nephew would cease drinking and gambling to a certain age, uncle promised to pay him a certain sum of money. You will see questions on the exam about Hammer versus Sidway. Again, go back and review the facts of the case, the legal dispute, and how the court analyzed the issue of consideration.
We know that Kevin Durant and the Phoenix Suns, they are very much struggling on the court. They are now down to on the verge of being out of the play-in.
This video covers the objective theory of contracts, and the objective theory of contracts is used to determine whether a party has the intent to be bound. So it is relevant both when determining whether there's an offer and when determining whether there's an acceptance. First slide asks, what is the objective theory of contracts? Again, it's used to determine whether a party has an intent to be bound. The objective theory of contracts tells the court to look at outward or objective manifestations of a party's intent. So we would consider things like verbal statements, nonverbal behaviors, and actions. Objective factors are indicators that are obvious to a third party. They are actions or statements that are available to a third party to enable that third party to determine whether this individual seriously intends to enter into this agreement. The objective theory of contracts tells us to ignore subjective indications of intent. Anything that a party is thinking but has not shared objectively with a third party would be irrelevant for determining intent. When we study this theory, sometimes it helps to identify examples of behaviors that do not qualify as intent to be bound. The first one is any statement that's made in jest. When you're interacting with someone and it is clear from their behavior that they are joking, then they would lack the intent to be bound. When someone speaks from anger, and that's obvious to the third party that they're acting out of anger, they lack the intent to be bound. When a party makes a statement of intention, they lack the intent to be bound. They may still be contemplating their interest in the transaction, but they haven't yet reached that point where they're ready to be bound to an agreement. Statements of opinion do not create intent to be bound. The general rule is that advertisements do not create intent to be bound. Advertisements are not offers. They are merely invitations to the public to enter the store and make an offer to purchase a product. And auctions with reserve do not have intent to be bound. On this last one, I would encourage you to go back and look at the notes from class and the textbook as a reminder of the difference between an auction with reserve and an auction without reserve. Before we exit this slide, just a note of caution. Remember that things like jest and anger, they only eliminate intent to be bound if they are objectively clear to the third party. So we studied a case in class called Lucy versus Zimmer. This was where the parties were negotiating for the sale of real estate, and the seller was in fact just joking. However, the seller in no way communicated that state of mind to the buyer. The fact that he was joking was maintained as a secret between he and his wife. All of his outward manifestations indicated that he was serious. And so in that case, the fact that he was joking did not delete intent to be bound. So when you read the slide in front of you, just remember that for joking and anger and intention and opinion to obliviate intent to be bound, they have to be clear, objectively clear to the other contracting party. On this slide, we're going to identify a few circumstances that generally do create intent to be bound. So this is a bit of a repeat of what I just stated, but anytime statements or negotiations are made from a perspective of joking, the party will still be considered to have intent to be bound if they don't make the existence of the joke aware to the other contracting party. So again, I encourage you to read Lucy versus Emmer and look at your notes from class. There very well should be some questions on the exam about this specific case, who the parties were, what happened, what they were arguing about, and how the court applied the objective theory of contracts. Auctions without reserve do have intent to be bound. Again, I just refer you to the textbook on this one. And number 3, advertisements that are limited in quantity, manner of acceptance, and are specific as to price create an exception to our general rule on advertisements. So remember, our general rule is that advertisements lack intent to be bound. Advertisements under our general rule do not create an offer to the public. What we see on this slide is an exception to that rule. When advertisements are written in a very specific manner, they do qualify as an offer. So if we look at the example provided in the last bullet, an advertisement that states 3 fur coats for sale for $1 each, first come, first served, on November 1, 2019. That's a very specific ad. It's very specific about the quantity. It's very specific about the price. It's very specific about the manner of acceptance. It says first come, first served, and it even specifies the date of performance. This very likely would qualify as an offer. What that means is that the first 3 people to enter the establishment and ask for the purchase of the fur coat, the store would have to service those first 3 people. The first 3 people that come in and want to buy a coat, we have to sell the coats to them for $1 each. If person number 1 walks in the store and for some reason we don't like them and we don't want to sell it to them, we generally don't have the option to refuse to sell because the advertisement was an offer. And when they walked in the store and picked up the fur coat, that was the acceptance. This video provides a quick review of the difference between a bilateral and a unilateral contract. First, we're going to start with the definitions. A bilateral contract is a promise in exchange for a promise. A unilateral contract is a promise in exchange for an act. On this slide, we'll look at an example of a bilateral contract. On September 1 of 2018, John and ABC Incorporated enter into the following agreement. John promises to provide a leadership training on December 1st, 2018 to 20 of ABC's top executives, and ABC Incorporated promises to pay John $3,000 on December 1 when he provides the training. So we see here that we have a promise in exchange for a promise. On the date that they create the contract, they identify the performance time and the performance expectations. So a few questions that we can ask about a bilateral contract. What is the date the agreement was created? Or what was the date that the contract was formed? That was on September 1. September 1 was when we had an offer, an acceptance, and consideration. What is the date of performance? Not until December 1 of 2018. What is the earliest point in time that the contract could be breached? It could be breached any time after it was created, so any time after September 1st of 2018. So the contract is created once we exchange promise in exchange for a promise, even though the performance doesn't happen until later on December 1. Now let's look at an example of a unilateral contract. We have a musician who lost his laptop. He claimed that the laptop stored several items of intellectual property. Through YouTube, the artist communicated that he would pay a $1 million reward to anyone who found and returned his laptop. An auto repair shop owner found and returned the laptop, but the artist would not pay the $1 million reward. The finder sued the artist, claiming the YouTube communication qualified as an offer for a unilateral contract. So here we see that there was actually no communication between the musician and the finder. The musician and the finder didn't meet and say, hey, finder, I'll pay you. I promise to pay you $1 million, with the finder saying, hey, musician, I promise to go find your lost laptop. That would have been a promise in exchange for a promise. This was different. Musician didn't even know the finder at the time that he made the offer. Musician created this YouTube video that said, to anyone who can respond to my offer, anyone who acts in the way that I'm requesting, I will pay a $1 million reward. In a unilateral contract, the acceptance does not come in the form of a verbal, I accept. It doesn't come in the form of a returned promise. With a unilateral contract, the acceptance comes by performing the requested act. So when the auto repair shop owner located and returned the laptop, that was the requested act, and that served as the acceptance. So on the date that the laptop was returned, we now had offer, acceptance, and consideration. So again, the finder is arguing that this was a completed unilateral contract, and the musician was arguing that there was no contract. The jury agreed with the finder. They agreed with the auto repair